Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a free 30-day trial at www.audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. Episode 35, Michonne. So one of my favorite characters on TV today, and it so happens is one of my favorite shows on TV today, is The Walking Dead. I just love The Walking Dead. I'm digging Fear the Walking Dead too, but I love The Walking Dead. Now, I know there's people out there that knock it, and I've never quite understood why. I mean, they got great characters, great storylines, very compelling, and if you read the comic, you can still watch the show because they switch it up a bit. And I love how the show and the comic have split so much that the show really is its own little universe. And as you may already know by the title, who we're going to be talking about on the show is Michonne, the katana-wielding badass who keeps Carl and Rick safe. Big spoiler warning on this episode. We're going to be talking about the Telltale game, the comic book, Fear the Walking Dead, and the television show. So if you are not totally caught up with any of those and you don't want spoilers, do not listen to this yet. Just hurry up, watch the rest of that season 7 and get caught up with those comics so you can listen to this episode. Before we start the show, again, head over to iTunes if you get a second and leave a review. The more reviews we can get over there, we can move up the rankings and more people will learn about us. I'd really appreciate it. Just head over to iTunes and leave a review. Also, head over to the site, click on the record button, and tell me who you'd like to hear me do an episode on. It's really simple. Head over to heroes, villains, and sidekicks.com, click on the record button, and leave me a message. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about Michonne was that, there are two different versions of her. There's like that for most of the people, but again, she's my favorite character on the show, so I'm going to talk about her. But she has a really big difference in the show and the comic. Now, you've got, of course, who she is in the show, who she is in the comic, and on top of that, we even get a little bit of a storyline about her in the Telltale video game, The Walking Dead Michonne. If you're not familiar with those games, they're really fun. They're almost like TV shows in themselves, where you're asked to, it's sort of like a picture book, one of those books where you could take a left and take a right and a different thing will happen. And that's what those games are like. I'm going to post some gameplay over at the site heroes, villains, and sidekicks.com so you can see what I'm talking about. And like I said, what they've done is they've actually done quite a bit with her backstory there in flashback. So it's pretty cool. We're going to obviously get into that a little bit later in the show. So I've been reading the comic since the first trade, and I hate to have to say trade. See, this is one of those painful comic book collecting stories. I was in my local comic shop in NC when I lived there, and I actually picked up a copy of The Walking Dead #1 off the rack, where there were a stack of them. I remember leafing through it, and even though I'm a huge horror fan, which I don't quite understand, I was buying everything else, I shrugged and I set it down. And if that doesn't, add insult to injury, I then went to a shop down the street, and I saw another stack, and I picked it up again and was like, oh, should I spend a couple bucks? Nah. And I put it down. And all I had to do was buy the stupid thing, buy a couple of the stupid things, and I could have quite the little sale on eBay. Keep one, of course, and sell the other. But I didn't, and that's life. That's how it goes. Maybe I'll be out there one day. I'll find some magical collection at a garage sale, and it'll be in there. That's why I have to stop at every garage sale, because you never know. There might be a copy of The Walking Dead #1 in there. So about Michonne, the funny thing is when I started to do the research for this, I realized I had forgotten a lot about Michonne's comic book origin, since I really haven't reread the comics in forever. I think I did a few times, but I really haven't gone back. And it's up to trade like 26 right now. And I mean, she shows up way back in volume 4 of the trade. So I had forgotten her origin. Now, I've watched all the seasons probably about a dozen times each while they were waiting for new ones to come on. So that one, that origin of her, that backstory, that little bit of a backstory that we got from her is really what stuck in my head. So it was really like, wait a minute, this is the actual origin of her, the comic book origin? I was really surprised. So again, if you're listening to this and you've only watched the show, this is, I think, going to be pretty neat for you to know what the comic book that sort of birthed the show, what she's like in the comic. So what I'll be talking about is Michonne's comic book origin and her television origin and the Telltale game series, Michonne, The Walking Dead, and I'll sort of just be going in between the 2 or 3 as points come up. And I'm going to be looking at some of her major points in the comics, some of her major storylines, and some of the other little idiosyncrasies that are different from the comic and the show. And again, I had forgotten a lot of what she was like in the comics. So this was really fun to research. And then, of course, we'll also be weaving in the Telltale game series because the cool thing about that is, and again, I didn't know this, the game tells the story of what happens and where Michonne is after the war between Negan. So in those episodes or in those issues, I am gonna screw up between episodes and issues in this podcast so much. But the game is set up as sort of 3 episodes, and it takes place actually, during the comics time jump. And so it's actually in between issues 126 and 139. Now, I've played a few Telltale games, but not this one, and I had no idea that it was actually filling in the gap in the comics. So, I actually watched someone do the gameplay, the Rad Brad, great channel for gaming and great gameplay on that. And I watched it all, and it was really, really good, and it really fills a huge gap in on Michonne's backstory, and of course I'm going to talk about that today. So let's go ahead and look at Michonne's comic book origin first, since it came first, right? Now, she was created, and the comic book was created by Robert Kirkman, Tony Moore, and Charlie Adlard. And of course, they are the ones listed as the creators of the comic and the television show. And the first appearance of Michonne was in issue 19 of The Walking Dead. Now, she arrives on the scene almost the same way as she does on the show. She arrives, dressed in her hooded cloak, followed by 2 jawless walkers she is leading around by chains. And of course, this makes sense, right? We saw Rick and Glenn get all gutsed up and walk through a mob of zombies unscathed. So her walkers, again, are doing that same thing. They're giving her that sort of olfactory camouflage. In the comic, Michonne comes across Otis, actually, and saves him from a few walkers. Yep, if you only watch the show, Otis lives for quite a while in the comic. He doesn't buy it quite so soon, and not like that. So after Michonne saves Otis, he brings her back to the prison where Rick and the gang are hanging their hats at that time. And it's when they're having this gang fight, sort of a fight between some of the prisoners that are left and then some walkers. And what happens is Otis is trapped outside and he's about to be overrun. And that's when Michonne rushes in to save him. And when he brings her back and when she gets there, she doesn't really get that warm of a reception. She does help out, but, she is obviously very dangerous, very capable with her sword. She has skills. She's killed quite a few walkers. They just saw that. And of course, they lock her up in one of the cells just in case she is dangerous, which is so funny now because in the comic and in the show, she is absolutely family. Obviously, she's with Rick at this point. So now let's see, how does this compare to the TV show? Now, in the show, Michonne makes her first appearance in the episode Beside the Dying Fire, the finale of season 2. Now, in this show, she actually shows up right at the end of the program to save Andrea as everyone flees from a herd and a fire that has overrun Herschel's farm. And I have to say, it looked so cool. The moon was behind her. It was dark. She had the hood, the zombies on the chains. It looked awesome. And, again, I'm going to be putting some clips from the show and tons of comic book pages over on the site heroesvillainsandssidekicks.com. Now, again, it was perfect. I totally dug it. So her introduction wasn't, totally different. She enters the picture to save one of the crew. However, in the comic, she goes from saving Otis to meeting the gang pretty much instantaneously. Now, on the show, however, she spends quite some time alone with Andrea. It seems like it's months, months and months, trying to keep her alive. She's sick. And the two of them actually, they don't go right to Alexandria. The two of them end up meeting with the governor's crew and get taken back to Woodbury, where Michonne just has a feeling the governor is no good. Again, this is the TV show. And Michonne ends up leaving Woodbury, only to be tracked down by Merle, who tries to kill her. And she gets away, of course, during this battle, and she sees Glenn and Maggie in town, and she's gotten away from Merle. But unfortunately, Merle sees Glenn and Maggie and takes them. And Michonne sees that they had some diapers, and she picks them up, and she starts walking, probably back from where they came. I can't remember exactly how she decides to walk towards this prison, but she does. And she eventually comes to the prison, which, again, they meet here quite warily, because here's this woman at the gate with two walkers in chains holding diapers. And then after telling the crew that a man who calls himself the governor took Glenn and Maggie, they all decided to go back to Woodbury to get them. Now, of course, this is very different from the comic. In the comic, when Michonne meets the governor, she's already part of Rick's group. And actually, Rick, her, and Glenn have gone out to investigate a helicopter they saw go down, when they are found and taken to Woodbury, thinking, they might be good people. Now, it's not until they get there that they realize they were quite wrong. And here's another huge instance where the show and comic diverge. In the TV show, she goes back because she hates the governor for tricking her and Andrea. She also thinks that he may have a woman chained up in his room, because when she sort of was sneaking around in there to get her sword back, she heard something. She also saw that he had a whole lot of zombie heads and fish tanks. He does that to sort of desensitize himself to the horrors. But, obviously that's a big red flag that this guy is nuts. So in the show, again, she goes back with Rick and the guys, and she finds the governor, and she goes into his room, and she thinks there's a person being held, but it's actually the governor's daughter, Penny, who is, of course, a zombie. Now, she's about to kill zombie Penny, and the governor comes in and begs for her not to, but she does. And then they fight a bit, and she actually cuts out his eye, and she escapes. Now, he made out quite a bit better than he did in the comic. Now, in the comic, the comic's a lot darker and a lot more violent. In the comic, when Rick, her, and Glenn are taken to Woodbury, they're separated almost immediately. Rick is in the infirmary because he is hurt. Glenn is put in a cell, and he's in a cell that's right next to Michonne, so he can hear what's happening. And this is part of his torture. And of course, Michonne is put into the cell next to him. And this is where it gets very dark. Now, the governor has Michonne tied up. He has his men tie her up. Her arms are over her head, and her legs are tied to the floor, and she's sort of like an X, sort of stretched out like an X shape. And his men strip her and, remove her pants, her clothing. And, for the next issue, or maybe more, a couple issues, again, I was reading in the trade, so I sort of lose track of where we end off. He tortures her, beats her, and, repeatedly rapes her. It is vicious, and they do some things where they actually have it where it's Glenn just listening to this because he can't not. It's right next door, and it is gruesome, and he's in tears. It's horrible. And what the governor wants to know is, where did they come from? Now, of course, Michonne doesn't break. And I have to say, it's a pretty hard read. It's one of the most graphic. I mean, they don't show, rape, or they don't show really much of the violence. It's always like afterwards, like what she looks like, and the sounds she's making when Glenn's listening. It's sort of like that scene in Reservoir Dogs where the guy cuts Mr. I can't remember which one he was, Mr. Black maybe, cuts the cop's ear off, Tarantino pans away. We know what's happening. We hear the screams and we cringe. And that's what you do in this. It's a great use of, the comic medium for storytelling. So like I said, we don't see a lot, but when we see her, her face is like hamburger. And again, Glenn is listening to this all next door. And this has always been the thing with me. So to me on the show, I never really felt why Michonne has such a strong reason to hate the governor. In the comic, it's quite understandable, but in the show, not so much for me. Now, in the comic, the revenge she enacts on the governor is in kind to what she received. When she gets loose in the comic, she doesn't just take his eye. She actually goes to his apartment, she knocks him out, and when he comes to, he's tied up, and she is standing before him with several implements, such as her katana, an electric drill, which at one point she just drives right into his shoulder, a spoon, and some other stuff. So she then begins to pretty much dismantle him, making sure to cauterize all his wounds so she doesn't bleed out. She does this slowly. She wants him to live. So first, she takes off his arm, slices it clean with her katana, cauterizes it. Then she takes out his eye with the spoon. It's some hard pages to look through. It's some pretty gruesome stuff. And after doing a bunch of other stuff, she pretty much finishes him off by cutting off his penis. I mean, she just, actually the whole thing down there. She just takes all the man parts, slop right off. And, she leaves him there alive. She makes sure she doesn't do anything that he couldn't survive. And he does live. Now a word from our sponsor, right? It's a great time for that. I just talked about all that. Now a word from our sponsor. For you, the listeners of the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekick show, Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to give you the opportunity to check out its service. Now, again, last time in the show, I recommended The Walking Dead: Rise of the Governor. It's an awesome novel. I remember reading this, and now I've been listening to it again, and you really get some insight in the governor. It is such a cool read to get this backstory. Anything you ever wanted to know about the governor, up until he started, being the governor, you will learn in that book. It is incredible. We're actually going to do a governor episode, so if you don't get a chance to listen to it, we'll do a podcast on it. But again, you can head over to Audible, get this thing free, and listen to it. It's just an awesome read and an awesome listen. So head over to www.audibletrial.com/heroes, villains, and sidekicks to download your free audiobook. Okay, so now she has just left the governor alive and in pieces. Of course, he lives, and he does, of course, go back to the prison with his men to try to destroy it. Pretty much at that point, they doesn't really even want it. He just wants revenge. Now, whereas on the show, the governor does return to the prison as well, but he's with his new group. And he isn't killed by Michonne or anyone. He's actually, in the show, he's killed by his new girlfriend after Michonne stabs him through the back to save Rick. Now, some similarities are there, but it's really different really where it counts. Now, actually, like I said earlier when I was talking through the commercial, I want to do a show on the governor because here's another character that has a very different arc when you compare the show and the comic. And then this is the cool part. You also get to explore not only the comic book origin and the show origin, but the novels, and especially the novel The Walking Dead: Rise of the Governor, written by Robert Kirkman and Jay Bonasinghe. That totally said that wrong. And that was released in 2011. It is an awesome book. And like I said earlier, you learn everything about him and his brother. And again, you can head over to Audible and download that and listen to it because it's a really cool book. All right, well, now back to Michonne, because if I start on the governor, I'm going to go down a tangent, and then I won't be able to do a governor episode, right? So let's get back to Michonne. Now, before we look at the next really big difference between her character and the comic and the show, I want to talk about a few little ones. The first one that I totally forgot about was that in the comic, when she first meets the group and begins to settle in, she is sort of drawn to Tyrese. Tyrese works out, she works out. But at this point in the comic, Tyrese is with Carol, who is and totally not like the Carol in the show. But hey, again, that's another episode, right? But, Michonne knows this. Michonne knows that Tyrese is with Carol, and she puts the moves on him anyway and comes on to him in a hard way and starts a, very intense sexual relationship with him. And Carol sees this, and it's just one more thing that sort of drives her over the edge. So that was an odd one to remember, that she was, very dark, very antisocial, and, did some really not so cool things in the group when she first got there. And of course, I don't remember her in the show really being attracted or being with anybody. Of course, now she's with Rick, whereas there's a big switch, right? Rick is with Andrea in the comic. Andrea is totally different as well. Again, these are all shows. If you'd like to hear shows like this more, like these comparisons, just leave a message or a comment over on the episodes page and look for the post Michonne, episode 35 Michonne, and in those comments say, yeah, I'd like to hear one of these comparisons on whatever. Or again, you can go ahead and leave a message, a voice message, and then I can play it. If you go to our homepage, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, just click on the record a message button. It's right at the top of the page or at the side of the page. And tell me who you'd like to hear one of these comparison shows on. And another small point that I didn't remember was that she talked to herself a lot in the comic. She was talking to family or she was talking to somebody. It's kind of like what Rick did when he sort of went off the rails and was talking on the phone to no one or to his dead wife. And of course, he did this in the comic as well. I really had forgotten how totally broken she was because she doesn't give off the vibe she does in the show and the comic. In the comic, she is very dark, very standoffish. And in the show, she's just much more open. You're saying, wait a second, Michonne is very quiet in the show. She's very guarded. She doesn't let her, guard down for quite a while. In the comic, more so. And that leads us to, in my mind, the biggest difference, what her life was before the world went to pot and, what she was doing, And again, this is really different. So here's where the book and the show really diverge. Now, some parts are the same, and her loss is just as rough in both. But I think it's worse, way, way worse in the comic. And the cool thing about piecing together her comic book origin is we can do this from multiple sources. We can look at the regular comic series, The Walking Dead. There was a special, The Walking Dead Michonne, and that really only has about 5 pages of new material that isn't in The Walking Dead, but it's 5 really big pages. And again, I'll have them, some of them over on the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. And we're going to be calling information from the Telltale game, which has tons of information on her backstory. So in the comics, we learn that before the outbreak, Michonne was a type A personality lawyer that worked at, I would think, is a pretty large firm in the city. She was moving up the ranks. I'm sure she was probably trying to make partner, trying to do well. We also know that she had a family, but that due to her job, she and her husband had a strained relationship and eventually separated and divorced. It's not clear if they were divorced or if they were separated. Now, here's where it starts getting, sad. It seems that, when the separation happened, it sounds like the outbreak was fairly close, maybe months, 6 months or so. It's hard to tell. They don't give, the show doesn't give the best of timelines for anything, but I'm going to say months, 6 months. So, this is different right off the bat. In the comics, she has a husband she is separated from, and in the show, Michonne has a boyfriend or husband. Again, it's hard to tell, and she's still with him. Although I don't think they're married. It's hard to tell in the show. Now, in the comic, we learn that Michonne, has some intense guilt about, her life before the outbreak. Now, again, we said that her and her husband split, and her husband kept the kids. They were girls, Colette and Melody, and she just figured, I got this from the Telltale game. Again, there's flashbacks where she's talking to herself in the flashback because she's seeing her girls. She's actually goes to the apartment. Well, we'll get into that in a bit. I get ahead of myself. But she figured she'd be working a lot, and the girls loved her dad, and she would visit and have them. But what happened is, over time, she started spending more time at work. She actually moved closer to her job and started seeing and visiting her kids less and less, until it sounds like that, as the world went to the pot, they might not have seen each other for months. And that would just be, that would be horrible to not have seen your kids for that long and to know you did that and then to lose them. Now, in the Michonne, The Walking Dead special, we get a view of Michonne we've never seen. We see her all dressed up. She's got a skirt on and sort of a shirt and a sports jacket, and she's running down the sidewalk, dodging walkers. Now, she makes it to a very nice looking apartment building, almost like a brownstone. And we learn that she lives with her boyfriend, and there's another person who might have been from one of the other apartment buildings who's a friend of his. Now, they fight off some zombies that are trying to get through the door when she's trying to get in, and her boyfriend is bitten. Now, at that point, they don't know what that means. They don't know he's going to turn. This is really, really early. The next few pages, we see Michonne out scavenging for supplies in some of the houses near hers. She says she's going through the neighbors' houses. And when she goes to one of the neighbors, whom I think she knows because she mentions how the boy was like a little serial killer in the making, she finds he has these katanas, these swords hanging in his bedroom, and she takes one because, she needs a weapon. And she actually doesn't get to go back home that night because it gets dark and there are too many walkers. Now, when she makes it back home, you guessed it, the boyfriend turned at some point, and of course, the friend wasn't ready and killed the friend, and now the friend turned. So she walks in, there are, her boyfriend and this guy as walkers trying to get her. She, of course, takes them out with a katana. Then we don't really see, this happen. They don't show this, but she gets the idea to chop their arms off, their lower jaws off, and chain them up and walk through the town so she can get out of there and use them as camouflage. So again, in the comic, it's not like she brings this up a lot. She does hint at she had a family and she had daughters, but she doesn't talk about it a lot. A lot of this stuff I'm telling you about, some of it is in that special, but a lot of it is also in this Telltale game that takes place, again, I mentioned, before she gets back to Alexandria in issue 146. So it is really fascinating. Now, the other really great part of the Telltale game, like I said, are these flashback scenes where it actually shows that Michonne did try to search for her kids. And I'm assuming this takes place before she goes back to her apartment and her boyfriend gets bit, like I was talking about in the special. And why I think that is because she doesn't have the katana at this point. So when she's looking through her ex-husband's apartment, she doesn't have the sword. So I'm assuming she got out of work, she ran to her ex-husband's house, she didn't have the sword yet, and they're not there. And she's frantic. She actually calls her friend of hers that, or maybe the friend calls her and is asking where the girls are. Where is the husband? Her name is Donna. He was supposed to take the girls to her house and they were going to get to safety. She is frantic. She's looking through the house. There's blood everywhere. She, of course, fears the worst. And when talking to Donna, of course, then all of a sudden Donna starts screaming. She gets attacked by a zombie as well. We don't see this, of course, but we know it. We can hear it. And then, again, this is sort of spaced out in the game. They would have a lot of game stuff, and then she'd have a flashback. And then something happens. Again, I guess the service being slow because of, the end of the world. She gets a sort of beep on her phone, and it's a voice message, and it's from her husband. And He is saying that he is going to take the girls. He's going to get to Donna's. You can hear the girls in the background. They're screaming for their mom. It's horrible. And, I'm going to get to Donna's, he's saying. I'm going to stay safe and we'll find you. And, and then the line goes dead. So we don't know. We're assuming they made it out of the apartment, but there is a dead, a zombie in the apartment that, I'm assuming the husband killed. And we don't know. We don't know. Now, Michonne says she does know. When she gets back to Alexandria after the Telltale game in issue 146, she comes right out and she tells Rick, I abandoned my children. I abandoned my daughters. He didn't know this story. He had heard Michonne telling Lori one time that she had children, but he never pushed it with her. And this is the first time he heard it. And she pretty much tells an abbreviated tale of what I just said, how estranged marriage and didn't see her, the kids. And Rick's like, wow. And he had no idea. And this all comes to the point where, she doesn't think she deserves to be happy. Because here she's going to be starting this relationship with Ezekiel, and she loves him. And Alexandria is this, bustling community at this point, and she doesn't feel she deserves to be happy. And Rick, of course, tells her that she does, that she's gone through hell, and they all have, and she didn't do, anything that anyone else wouldn't have done, and how was she to know? It was obviously much more moving than what I'm saying, because I don't know verbatim, but it was great, and it sort of did the trick. One thing I did forget to mention is that in the beginning of the Telltale game, Michonne is actually on her knees holding a gun, and she puts the gun in her mouth. She's going to commit suicide. She is feeling so guilty about being happy and maybe this new life and what she did with her daughters that she's about to kill herself until she is stopped by I think his name was Peter, who then she ends up going on the boat with for this adventure, which is the Telltale game. Watch those episodes. The one I watched that I really liked was the Rad Brad's channel. I'll put a link on the site. Great job. So now she had twin girls. If you watch the show, like I do, I had only remembered it that way. And in the show, she has a boyfriend that she has a child with, but it's a baby boy named Andre. And we see this in sort of a flashback / nightmare where she and her boyfriend and his friend are talking about art from an art gallery. And we can see that she's professional, she's smart, she's witty. It's the first time we've seen her, pre-apocalypse, where she's all bright and sunny and happy. And it was really great to see. And we also learn what happened at the end through a series of quick jumps, and then what she talks to Carl about, in that they escaped, they made it to a camp. She was out at a camp, getting supplies. She had the sword already at that point. And when she returned, the camp had been overrun, and her child was dead. And she pretty much says it was because her boyfriend and her friend were high at the time. Now, they may have been bitten, they might have been dying already, we don't really know, but it's in that point in the show, because we've seen these two, the boyfriend and the friend, that we then realize that in the show, they are the zombies she is using as camouflage. So she used her boyfriend and her friend as those zombies. Again, if they had screwed up and my son had died because of it, they would be my camouflage as well. So, pretty rough, but I'd have to say, as bad as that was, the show, I think the guilt over choosing your work and, abandoning your children, not seeing them for months, and then knowing that they're dead, that would be a guilt and a regret that would destroy you. I personally can't imagine it. I can't imagine never being able to say goodbye, maybe not even remembering the last time you saw them. So then knowing that, and seeing how that happened in the game, it makes a lot of sense in how closed off and broken she was in the comic when we first saw her. So those are some big points where the comic and the show diverge, but let's look at one more that's pretty substantial. Now, in the comic, Michonne has a few love interests. Like I mentioned earlier, she hooks up with Tyrese, and then we see her with a brief relationship with Morgan, actually, when he joins the group. And then, of course, more recently, King Ezekiel. So that's sort of her arc, romantic arcs in the comic. But they were, she was never really, she never really seemed all in with those. Maybe with Ezekiel, but again, as we talked about, she was so racked with guilt over her daughters, she wouldn't let herself be happy with him. Now, also, of course, the zombie apocalypse, that's got to be, a pretty big buzzkill when you're trying to start a relationship. So one of the coolest things that I have just been digging in the show is that her and Rick are together. She's pretty much, become Carl's surrogate mom through the seasons. They have such a great relationship. They've fostered that right from the beginning with her, where he was the first one that really saw she was a good person and told the dad that she's a good one, she's one of us. And to see her and Rick together, it's probably been the thing I've enjoyed most out of this last season. And I dug this whole season. It was a little uneven here and there, but still fantastic. So those are some of the big moments in Michonne's arcs in both the show and the comic and how they differ. As you can see, they're pretty huge. She is a much, much different character in the comic than she is in the show. I guess the core of her is there, but she's much more open. She's much more free. She's much more alive in the show. And she's much more closed off in the comic. Don't get me wrong, she would do anything for anybody in that group in the comic. But she's just distant. And this is why, this horrible thing from her past that she won't let herself be free of. So I hope you dug this episode where we got to look at these big differences. If you want to hear other shows like this with other characters from The Walking Dead, the Governor, Rick, Shane, that'll be a short episode. You want to hear the Shane one? So go ahead and head over to the site and leave me a voice message on who you'd like to hear me do a show on. Just click on the little button and leave a message. So again, this was a really fun show. I enjoyed rereading those comics. Again, Michonne is one of my favorite characters. Also, if you have a second, please head over to iTunes and leave a review. The more reviews we get, the higher we can go up the rankings and the more people can learn about us. Also, head over to the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com, where I'm going to have clips from the Telltale game, tons of pages, and some clips from the show. So just head over there, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. Our theme music is by Broke for Free, and if you want to hear about any of the other music that we have on the podcast, just head over to the site, heroesvillainsandsidekicks.com. Well, I'm Kevin Volo, and this has been the Heroes, Villains, and Sidekicks show episode on the origin and backstory of Michonne. Again, I want to thank you for listening. We'll be back next week. Take care.